It's our great pleasure to have Maya Kapoor from High Country News visiting with us as a media fellow and speaking today. She is a science and environmental writer with more than a decade's experience as a field biologist and environmental educator in the Western United States and Latin America. She reports on climate change, biodiversity, environmental policy, and environmental justice. In addition to having her work appear in High Country News, she has written for The Atlantic, Business Insider, Long Reads, and Mother Jones. She is one of our 3 distinguished 2018 Summer Media Fellows. So without further ado, I'll turn the podium over to you, Maya.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. Well, before I got started, I wanted to thank Vermont Law for giving me the opportunity to be here for 2 weeks and take a class and learn from everybody who's here. So thank you so much for this experience. I'm already getting story ideas and getting excited about exploring new areas I hadn't written about before. So thank you. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how science is being eroded in rare species protections, and I think, so just to make it clear, like there are a lot of examples of this. I'm just covering the ones that I've written about or that I followed. So hopefully you'll think of this as a starting point to thinking about this issue a little bit more. I'm not going to be talking about state or tribal entities or other governmental entities that have their own approaches to rare species protections. I'm just looking at the federal government today. Oh, and also that's a picture of a jaguar because I live in Arizona, and Arizonans get really excited about the jaguars that wander into Arizona and Mexico. Okay, so just for some context, there are quite a few federal regulations actually related to rare species. The first was the Lacey Act, which was passed in 1900 and was pretty quickly followed by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And the reason I have this picture of this hat is because there was a lot of activism from people who were concerned about disappearing bird populations. And the Migratory Bird Treaty Act was actually passed as a rider to an agricultural appropriations bill, so it was kind of snuck in there. But it protects migratory birds that fly between the US and Canada. That was followed by the Bald Eagle Protection Act. And today, bald eagle and eagles are still protected by this act, and it regulates how people can use or take bald eagles, their parts, their nests, their eggs, that includes feathers. And it also criminalizes, like bringing in or importing protected species like bald eagles. And it defined take as shooting, poisoning, wounding, killing, capture, trapping, things like that. But then the really big movement happened around the Endangered Species Act in 1973. It passed with pretty much almost everyone in the Senate and the House of Representatives voted for the Endangered Species Act, which is kind of unheard of today. And it was followed a few months later by CITES, which regulates how species that are rare internationally are traded or moved into the United States and among other countries. So I'm just going to be focusing on the ESA today, the Endangered Species Act. So it passed with almost unanimous support, like I said, and it followed the Endangered Species Preservation Act, by which was a kind of a nod towards the idea that species were disappearing and we needed to do something. But the Endangered Species Act actually made a big difference. It protected both species and their habitat. It required science-based plans for how species were going to be recovered, and it legislated protecting habitat. It also suspended federal activity that was found to jeopardize endangered species or critical habitat. And just so you know, it's enforced by 2 different entities within the government. So for terrestrial species, it's Fish and Wildlife Service. And for marine species, it's National Marine Fisheries Service, which is part of NOAA. Okay, so even though it passed, in a very popular way in Congress, the ESA has always been contested. So these days, people who are pro-ESA say, 99% of the species that get listed don't go extinct. So that's a sign of success. And they also have what I call like the intelligent tinkering argument, which is a reference to Aldo Leopold, who said, if the biota in the course of eons has built something we like but do not understand, then who but a fool would discard the seemingly useless parts? To keep every cog in wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. And today you can think of that as environmental economics, kind of embracing some of that idea. On the other hand, people who think the ESA is failing point out that only around 2% of species have recovered enough to delist in the entire time of the law's existence. And meanwhile, designations are limiting how we can use federal lands. One of the reasons that there has been a low level of action, like listings, delistings, is because one way that the ESA has always been politicized is through funding. So the amount of money that can be spent on listing species is capped by Congress every year. When agencies run out of that money, they can't use other monies that they have. And that really leads to a backlog. So this picture is a Sierra Nevada red fox. It's one of the rarest mammals in North America. There's probably fewer than 50 individuals left. And it's been a candidate under consideration for listing for several years. And then just to kind of talk a little bit more about that, another species that I've written about personally is whitebark pine. And it's a keystone species in the Intermountain West. Everything from birds to bears rely on it for food. The things that are challenging it are kind of hard to address. It's things like introduced bush arrest, climate change, which leads to bark beetle infestations, fire suppression. This is a plant that needs fires to clear the landscape so that its seeds can regenerate. People have been trying to get this plant protected for more than a quarter century. But because of that triage that Fish and Wildlife Service has to do, it has a category called warranted but precluded. So in 2011, whitebark pines are found to be warranted but precluded. That means, you're right, this species does need to be protected, but there are other species that we need to deal with first. And biologists have said that the pine tree is probably going to go extinct in most of the US in the next 100 years, which for whitebark pine is like 2 generations. So those are some of the challenges that the ESA already had. But now there's a big push to decrease federal regulations, all kinds, and to increase domestic energy production. This affects rare species directly, just by weakening the science behind the listing process, which I'll give you some examples of. It also affects rare species indirectly because, of course, species live in the world, and if laws that protect their habitat or other things that they need are weakened, then that affects them directly. This is a picture of a greater sage-grouse. There was a really interesting and unique collaborative effort to protect this species without listing it federally, and that's kind of being undermined now too. I'll come back to that. So this agenda is playing out in every branch of government. I'm going to focus on the executive today, where things like executive orders, controversial political appointments, and new regulatory approaches are all affecting how science can be applied in the Endangered Species Act. But also, just to point it out, there are things happening in the judiciary. So sometimes people will try to pass laws that mean you have to go to arbitration if you're concerned about an endangered species and the effects that a company is having on it. There's efforts to weaken the ability to sue Fish and Wildlife Service because of perceived endangered species violations. And our Supreme Court nominee, Kavanaugh, is kind of a wild card right now too, but people have some ideas about which way he's going to be thinking, which is pro-industry and maybe not so pro-environment. And on the legislative side, there's just constantly riders and bills to delist, to change listing process, like I said, to change judicial remedy options. And as a writer, it gets really confusing because there was a time when I would look at bills working their way through Congress, and if they came out of committee, it's like, okay, that's something we should cover. But at this point, Congress is so polarized, bills can come out of committee and still die. So sometimes it's like, okay, there's so many bills, there's so many writers, that could affect endangered species, but at what point do you start to really pay attention to it? That's gotten a little bit tricky. And this is a picture of poor little coot that landed in, so it was a pool that an oil company created to evaporate out water and leave behind waste. But this bird landed in it, and it's probably not going to do that well. And I just bring that up because in a little while I'm going to talk about the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and just kind of let you know a little bit about how that's been changing. So in response to executive orders from President Trump, in particular, the one focused on increasing energy independence, the Department of the Interior has been working really hard to streamline the listing process and to delist and downlist species. This strategic plan for the Department of the Interior was leaked, and it's my first example for today of something coming out of the executive branch that is really eroding the science in endangered species listings. So it focuses on downlisting and delisting, and it tries to make complying with the unsafe faster and less expensive. Well, how do you do that? One way is to push for more state involvement in the unsafe regulations, which that leaked plan does suggest. And that probably doesn't sound like such a bad thing, but it depends on who's involved and how they're involved in species protection processes, which I'll get into a little bit. And I just thought this was kind of a funny before and after. So this is from the homepage of the Department of the Interior in 2017. And the left side is what it used to look like, which is a family hiking, and the right side is what it then looked like, which is a coal seam. Kind of points to the shifting priorities of the DOI. So that strategy of changing the memberships of SSAs, that's Species Status Assessment Teams. Previously, so does anybody here know what a Species Status Assessment Team is? Okay, so let's say a species is up for listing, and the people who talk about that are the Fish and Wildlife Service. You know, they're not experts on every single candidate species. So a group of experts get together and produce like a very simple, straightforward document. What is the species? Where does it live? What does it eat? What are historical challenges? Why are its numbers dwindling? Things like that. So your team might include, like for instance, the Canada Lynx team had people who were lynx experts from Canada and the US, but also people who were forest ecologists who specialized in the kind of forest where you find lynx, and people who were GIS specialists who did mapping of lynx habitat. And the idea is that Fish and Wildlife Service needs basic information, and then all the fighting can start based on the information. The DOI now wants states to have more say in the science of species listings, which sounds great, right? The fact is, states already do have experts involved. So one example is Gila trout. That's a rare fish that lives in New Mexico and Arizona. And the species status assessment team might have members of Game and Fish who are Gila trout experts. So they know the science, they come from the state, and that's fine. The change is that Greg Sheehan, who's the de facto head of Fish and Wildlife Service right now, started this new policy, which is that SSAs must include at least 2 state-appointed members from each state where a species is found. So if you think about that, something like the gray wolf, its range covers 9 states. That's 18 state-appointed officials. They don't have to be scientists. And the interesting thing about Greg Sheehan is that he was appointed to the Fish and Wildlife Service as acting deputy director, so he never had to go through a Senate confirmation process. Previously, when he was the director of Utah's Division of Wildlife Resources, he was really unhappy and wrote an op-ed about a finding. So PETPO is the People for the Ethical Treatment of Property Owners, and they sued Fish and Wildlife Service saying, you know, in this case it was Utah prairie dogs. If the species occurs entirely within one state, then the federal government should have no say over the management of that species. The state should. And they used Utah prairie dogs as their test case, in part because, like, people in the West, a lot of people hate prairie dogs. But approximately 70% of listed species occur within the confines of one state. So that could have had a huge impact on how the ESA works. And actually, at first, the courts agreed with them, and then the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals reversed that decision. So, Sheehan already was very much interested in state control, and something else about him is that he's not a career scientist. His educational background is in business administration and finance, whereas generally speaking, the Fish and Wildlife Service heads who came before him were career scientists. But he didn't have to have a Senate confirmation hearing, so because he's in a mayor position. And then another way that the executive is sort of being wishy-washy about science is by kind of pulling back on concerns about climate change projections and rare species. So this is one of the largest mammals, I guess finned mammals in the world. It's a Pacific walrus. And basically it really needs ice to live successfully and reproduce. So it depends on patches of frozen ice to reach its offshore breeding sites and its feeding areas. We don't really know how many of them are left. And in 2011, it was awarded warranted but precluded status. So Fish and Wildlife Service said, yes, we're concerned about this animal. It probably needs protection. We'll get to it. But then in 2017, that listing was denied. The Fish and Wildlife Service concluded that, well, we don't know enough about what climate change is doing, so we can't really say how the species is going to do after a few decades. And at the same time, Fish and Wildlife Service also said that they believe that the walrus will just adapt to not using ice anymore and using like dry land to breed and eat. Interestingly, the bearded seal is also a marine mammal that is considered to be threatened by climate change, and NOAA came to a different conclusion. They said, yeah, we do need to protect the species. And there's been one of the things that is constantly coming up, I think, in legislation is the effort to move diadromous species solely to the purview of Fish and Wildlife Service. So something that's diadromous spends part of its life in the ocean and part of its life in freshwater, so like salmon or eel. When they're in the ocean, NOAA is in charge of them, and when they're in freshwater, Fish and Wildlife Service is. I've heard from sources that, for whatever reason, NOAA runs into less politics and less issues with its listing efforts. So to move all of those species to Fish and Wildlife Service when the service is already overburdened could really affect those species. And it includes things like salmon, which are really contested in the Pacific Northwest right now. And then I had mentioned Greg Sheehan, who's holding the map, and how he was more of a career politician than a career scientist. Another example of moving scientists out of the DOI and replacing them with political appointees is Susan Combs. So the administration attempted to have her put in charge of budgets at, I think DOI, I can't remember if it was just Fish and Wildlife Service or the entire DOI, but a position that involved budgets. And she did go through a Senate confirmation process and she was not confirmed. But May 2017, she was given a temporary position, assistant for Fish and Wildlife Service and Parks, which puts her actually in charge of, so Fish and Wildlife Service is now below her control, and she was given that position really quietly. It was in a memo from Zinke that was released on a Saturday morning. It was never announced on the Department of Interior website. And I wanted to look at that memo this week just to kind of see if there's anything else in it of interest. And it's not even on the Department of Interior website anymore. I could probably find it if I spent a lot of time looking around, but the link that I had is taken down. So Susan Combs is interesting because she's from Texas, she's a rancher and a politician. She has a history of hostility towards protected species. When she was comptroller in Texas, she took over the state listing process. She's referred to endangered species as incoming Scud missiles. And I think it's remarkable not only that appointees such as these two, but many others as well, are no longer scientists, but also that there's a lot of secretiveness in the way that they work. So Greg Sheehan's memo, so the memo that said that now SSAs have to include state representatives came from Greg Sheehan, and that memo was never made public, it was leaked. I saw the leaked memo, somebody took a photograph of a computer screen, and then Susan Combs' appointment was very secretive. So that's another way that science is being suppressed, because if we don't know what information people are using, then we can't come to any conclusions about it. And then, has anybody here been following what's going on with SageGrouse in the West? Okay, good, one person. So it's like, I almost didn't mention it because I just don't even like talking about it. But, so SageGrouse, the SageGrouse initiative was pretty interesting. It was a new way to deal with endangered species management. And the basic idea was that a group of, oftentimes at odds partners got together, so environmentalists, ranchers, even the extractive industries, some tribal representatives, private property owners, and they agreed that sage-grouse needed to be protected, but they decided that they would come up with a system where they would conserve the best sage-grouse habitat. So sage-grouse live out in the West in sagebrush, like basically sagebrush fields, and that habitat is diminishing a lot because it's where a lot of extractive industries happen. Cities in the West are getting bigger. Invasive species of grasses have come through, and then they make the sagebrush, or the sagebrush fire prone. So their habitat's diminishing. The partners would conserve the best sage-grouse habitat, and in exchange, other habitat that did have the species present could be developed. Also, the bird would not be listed as federally endangered. It took years to make this, I think 5 years maybe, to come up with this policy. But now Bureau of Land Management is rewriting it. They're rewriting the environmental impact statements, and they've started to undo some habitat protections. They also tried really hard to breed sage-grouse in captivity, which I thought was interesting because, of course, the Endangered Species Act protects not only species, but the places that they need to survive. And I wondered if this was a push to start emphasizing more like species numbers. But it was really unsuccessful. The one company that was contracting to do it just gave up earlier this year, I think. There's currently a rider in the defense bill that would bar listing sage-grouse for 10 years. And just also as an aside, it would delist another species, that a beetle that lives in the Permian Basin where a lot of oil extraction happens. And I pointed this out just because I think a lot of times an argument that you hear for undoing federal protections is states' rights. This is an example, especially in the West where I live, a lot of people get really hot and bothered about states' rights. This is an example of people trying to really promote local control, and it's still being undone. And then another example, so like I said, around 1,200 federal species are currently listed as endangered, but several hundred are also listed as threatened. If you're endangered, you're about to go extinct. If you're threatened, you're close to becoming about to go extinct. So it's slightly less dire, it's still not good. And since 1978, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has just given the same protections. They're called blanket protections. So basically, if the species is listed as threatened, then you kind of have to go through the same thing, like with habitat protection and whatnot. But if you were a landowner who was affected by that blanket protection, then you could apply for an exemption. So there's been a leaked proposed rule that would end blanket protections for threatened species. And already this past spring, Louisiana pine snake, which this is a picture of, it's one of the rarest species of snake in North America. It got threatened status, but that didn't affect any of the activities that happen in its habitat, which mainly are timber production and some activities by private landowners. So those things, which include forest management, herbicide applications, can still happen. And I suppose if someone wanted to, the blanket rule sort of flipped. Now they could apply for an exemption saying these activities really should be stopped in this place. Okay, so those are just some examples. And then I mentioned the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So these are some other federal regulations that are currently being weakened or the science is kind of being tamped down. I'm not going to go through them the way I just did with the ESA, but I just wanted to make you aware of them if you weren't. So Migratory Bird Treaty Act, it now only covers, it formerly covered any take of migratory birds, whether intentional or not. Now it only covers birds that were killed intentionally, so that's like if you were hunting them, poaching. So things like oil spills, transmission lines, wind turbines, et cetera, are no longer covered. And the Deepwater Horizon spill, a lot of the money that came to communities because of that spill was related to violations of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and that would no longer apply in a case like that. Then the Magnuson-Stevens Act was created to help maintain sustainable fisheries in our coastal waters. So it was trying to balance the need for the economics, being able to fish, but also not depleting fisheries. So there's a bill that the House passed recently, and again, I don't know if that means it's going to happen or it's going to die. I can't tell anymore. But it would give states more power to determine fishing quotas rather than doing that based on scientific evidence of what's actually happening with the fish. The Marine Mammal Protections Act. So salmon, as I mentioned before, are really contested in the Northwest, and they've had a hard history. They are born in rivers, they swim out to the ocean to grow up, and then they go back to the rivers where they were born to breed. And there's been so much damming in the Pacific Northwest that it's really created struggles for, a lot of our salmon species are listed now. One way to get around that is that people were constructing fish ladders, which are just ways for fish to get past the dams. Well, marine mammals like to go there where the fish are sort of bottlenecked and have lunch. And so the Marine Mammal Protection Act criminalizes or regulates either harassing or taking marine mammals, but congressional Republicans are pushing to change the Marine Mammal Protection Act to make it legal to cull sea lions to increase salmon populations, rather than looking at kind of the ultimate reason that populations are dwindling and what else can be done for salmon. And then there's currently a comment period open on NEPA. There's plans to revise NEPA to include more state control and less regulation. And it's kind of been equivalent, making state control and less science equivalent, because that's where the politics kind of come in. So some things that I'm interested in watching right now. There's a case that the Supreme Court has agreed to hear, and it's whether or not critical habitat can be designated in a place where this species currently does not live. The test case is this animal, the dusky gopher frog. This is out of my range of coverage. I write about the West, and this is in Mississippi and Louisiana, but it could really have a lot of impacts for endangered species everywhere. It might seem strange to call something critical habitat when the animal isn't there, but there's a lot of reasons that could happen. In the case of the dusky gopher frog, this timber company is fighting designation of critical habitat, but it is a place where the frog once lived. And it's the best option available to them, to the frogs at this point, because so much of their habitat is gone. And it's also really interesting to me because, again, I see this as minimizing the science of climate change. Things that are rare or dwindling and live in one place now won't necessarily live there in 40 years. So how do you kind of navigate that issue? This could also be Kavanaugh's first Supreme Court case, and as I mentioned earlier, he does have a history, from what I understand, of ruling in favor of industry and not the environment, finding in favor of industry, not the environment. Something else I've been watching are some of the riders in the Farm Bill and the Defense Spending Reauthorization Bill. They involve either specific organisms that people don't want listed, or that they want delisted, like gray wolves, or other provisions that somehow speed up or weaken the endangered species listing process, which always cuts into the time needed for the investigations. And then just in the news this week, I don't know if anyone's been following this, but there's like a big push with a lot of different hearings and legislation I don't know if it's because it's ahead of the midterms, they just want to get it done, but to change the Endangered Species Act wholesale. So from my perspective, trying to cover this has gotten more challenging. So I wanted to give you guys a number of, I wanted to look at the rates of down and delisting over past presidencies. And there used to be a spreadsheet showing every year how many species and which species were downlisted and delisted on the Fish and Wildlife, that you could access from the Fish and Wildlife Service's website. And now that link is broken. I can't find that. I've also run into the issue in covering a lot of different topics where federal scientists now have to get permission from their press officers to speak to reporters. So I wrote a story recently about the efforts to lift the uranium mining moratorium around the Grand Canyon, and I wanted to speak to someone who had, a biologist at the USGS actually, who had done surveys and analyzed how more uranium mining could affect rare species in the area, and Heather Swift said I couldn't talk to her and wouldn't say why. And then finally, what you can do as a member, as anyone can do actually, but a member of the press, if you really need some information, like if I really wanted that spreadsheet, you couldn't get it, I could do a Freedom of Information Act request. However, as far as every agency I dealt with is really backlogged, whether it's EPA, USGS, Department of the Interior. They have so many FOIAs right now, and they're and supposedly they're intentionally slowing the process down. So you could FOIA something right now and not get your results in 2 years, and if you're a journalist, it doesn't really work. So that's it. I thank you for coming, and these are Selkirk caribou. They used to range from Maine out to Washington State, and now there are 3 left in the United States, in the lower 48, and they're all female. So that's what I'm having.
Questions? I have a question to kick off. Can you talk a little bit about the pending comprehensive rewriting of the Endangered Species Act, and what it involves and what the politics of it look like?
So I don't know it that well. I know that, yeah, I haven't looked that closely at it because these bills come up so often to do just that, and it's hard to know when it might actually happen, but this one might actually happen. But I know that a lot of the push has been to include more economic, for example, economic considerations in listings. So people do think about economic considerations when they're designating critical habitat. But in the Endangered Species Act, when it comes to listing, you're only supposed to look at the status of the species and the science, and not economics. So that's one thing that I know that Republicans have pushed for a lot. They've also been pushing for faster delistings, and I'm not sure if that was included too. But again, there's no increase in funding for Fish and Wildlife Service, so it's asking for more work without more funding. But I don't know more about that. I'm sorry.
I mean, traditionally, the political pathway has been that the House of Representatives passes a radical rewrite of the Endangered Species Act. They ship it over to the Senate, and it dies in the Senate. And they've been doing that for a long time now.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. There is a bill in the Senate that is less radical right now, but who knows how they're going to reconcile.
Other questions? Come on.
What about uncertainty in science? I mean, I understand science and politics, and there's a lot of interplay which comes in environmental issues. But how would you classify that science is also uncertain? So when this uncertainty comes, which we classify as junk science or bad science or good science, then does this uncertainty fit into, would it be right to say it's a question of politics?
I don't know if this is directly answering your question, but when I've looked at species status assessments, for example, for the Canada lynx, so background, in 2016, Fish and Wildlife Service found that Canada lynx should probably be listed as threatened, but then in 2017, like 6 months later, they said actually it doesn't need to be listed at all. And when I looked at those species status assessments, trying to figure out what changed, because there was a species status assessment previously, and then there was one for the new decision, I did notice that, one of the things that was an area of uncertainty, of course, is climate science and its effects on. It's much easier to model predictions about like a large swath of land or a large climate weather system. It's much harder to say that means this place is going to be like this, or this species is going to do this. And so what they did for Canada lynx, which depends on really, really deep snow to be able to kind of bound around and move, and then it hunts snowshoe hare, which also live in kind of boreal forests. They created predictions that were like, okay, best case scenario, worst case scenario, and then sort of like the middle path, and that middle ground is what they used to make recommendations. So I think there is that acknowledgement that the science may not be. I mean, sometimes it's simple, right? It's like this mollusk lives in one spring in Nevada. There's like Nevada spring snails, and if you pump the groundwater, it's going to dry out, and then the mollusk will be gone. Like, that's simple. But in cases where there's a lot of uncertainty, they try to come up with alternative possibilities. And again, the species status assessment teams are not supposed to be making policy recommendations. They're just supposed to be providing information to the people who then make those decisions.
Might be incredibly naive or sensational, but where does the law stand, or does it stand at all, with regards to like cloning and genetic manipulation as a means to preserve endangered species, critically endangered, like this case?
I don't
there
know
aren't
that,
any male in the species left.
Right, so like there's the example of, there's a subspecies of rhino, right? I think I read about in the news that people are trying to basically have a surrogate mother from, in a closely related species of rhino. And so things like that happen. I don't know, I have read a lot about conservation genetics, and I don't know, I guess one thing that has come up is the idea that subspecies also should be protected, and that is related to genetics for sure. And I've been to a fish hatchery in New Mexico, where they are trying to breed endangered, threatened Gila trout for release in the wild, and they do all these things where every fish has a tag, and they make sure they're not breeding the same fish together too often and trying to keep the fish from becoming domesticated. But I don't know that anything has been specifically written about cloning, and I don't know if anyone else has heard anything. I mean, honestly, Fish and Wildlife Service doesn't have money to like cut down trees sometimes. Like cloning. Sorry?
They don't have money to clone caribou.
Well, there are some of this species that lives in Canada. They're just going, and the populations of this particular caribou, like they were kind of spread out in different mountain ranges. So this population that was unique to this area is disappearing, but there are others, and they're also kind of not doing that hot in Canada as well.
Can I ask one more question, please? Just a question on it, it's in my mind. What is the approach of judiciary in terms of protecting these critically endangered species? Is it more based on anthropocentrism, or is there a shift which is taking towards ecocentrism? Because globally there are changes that are taking place. So how responsive is the judiciary, American judiciary, in terms of these global changes?
Yeah, I mean, I know. Are you talking about like efforts to protect the rights of rivers, for example, or give personhood?
Ecocentrism is essentially where they treat, rather than humans, exploiting the resources, humans and the nature, including all these critically endangered species, they live together. you know, they are a part of it. So there should not be any exploitation taking place. And the judicial decisions which are coming at the global level, essentially particularly from the developing countries, are really focusing upon these issues.
I haven't seen any clear examples of that kind of focus in our judiciary. I don't know if other people know of examples. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of like chimpanzees using medical experiments, like, but I'm kind of reaching.
Because India, South Africa have taken a lead in this, particularly India has taken a lead where the focus is now more towards ecocentrism rather than anthropocentrism.
I would not categorize our judiciary that way. And it's interesting too, because I know in other places that approach is helpful in conservation for things like the rights of a river, and then that protects an entire habitat, whereas in the US, especially in the West, where I report, it's very much use it or lose it. There's very little room for conservation for its own sake. And something that I thought was interesting with that DOI leaked strategic plan, it really emphasizes using natural resources, but conservation isn't considered a use, which I thought was interesting. Is this mic still on?
No. Yeah.
Go ahead.
You are one of many responsible and outstanding journalists working in this area. I'm wondering if you have support from, say, the Society of Environmental Journalists or some other organization that is providing support and information to help all of you to get this information that you need.
It's interesting. I'm very careful about, like, for instance, Center for Biological Diversity sends me press releases or emails me like weekly, but they're an advocacy group. So I've interviewed them. I've worked with them on stories, not worked with them on stories, but used them as sources. But keeping in mind that they have an agenda. As far as finding like leaked information, things like that, I have a couple, like I have some places where I look, or I've talked off the record to a lot of people. And that's something that's really interesting because, as a journalist, you never want to talk to someone off the record. You want all the information you provide to the public to be traceable. But more and more career scientists are afraid of losing their jobs if they speak out. But there's Society for Environmental Journalists, there's also a group of like science writers, and a lot of it's through social media, which is interesting. But the National Association of Science Writers can be a helpful resource. But yeah, it's sort of kind of all, we're talking amongst ourselves about like media issues. And in fact, when Heather Swift wouldn't let me talk to that one person, the press officer who had to tell me was really upset about it because they want their information out.
Pause. Should we wrap it up?
I think we're good.
Right, thank you very much.